He once told an interviewer that history would remember him as one of two things, a legend or a wreck. At 60, the answer turned out to be neither and both, and something far more complicated than either label ever managed to capture. Charlie Sheen is alive. He is sober. He is a grandfather in waiting, a father trying to make up for lost years, and a man who has spent the back half of his life doing something Hollywood rarely asks of its biggest names, sitting quietly with the wreckage he created and trying to understand it rather than perform it. That, more than any scandal, may be the most surprising part of his story now. Not that he fell, but that he is still here, still working through what the fall actually cost him. To understand why Charlie Sheen's story feels less like a celebrity cautionary tale and more like a genuine tragedy, it helps to remember what came before the chaos. He was born Carlos Erwin Estevez in New York City in 1965, the son of Martin Sheen, an actor who had already begun building one of the more respected and thoughtful careers in American film. Acting was not an aspiration in the Sheen household. It was a family trade, discussed at the dinner table the way other families might discuss medicine or law. Martin Sheen had grown up with his own hardships, arriving in New York as a young man with almost nothing. And by the time Charlie was born, the family had settled into a life shaped by film sets, auditions, and the unpredictable rhythms of an actor's income. Charlie grew up around that world not as an outsider looking in, but as a child for whom it was simply ordinary life. He watched his father disappear for months at a time to work on films, and he watched the toll that absence sometimes took on the family left behind. That early exposure gave him an advantage almost no aspiring actor receives, but it also normalized an industry that most people spend years learning to navigate carefully from the outside. By the time he was a teenager in Malibu, Charlie was already making short films with friends who would go on to become some of the most recognizable actors of their generation, including Rob Lowe, Sean Penn, and Emilio Estevez, his own older brother, who had already begun building his own acting career under the family name. Those early amateur films, shot on borrowed equipment with more enthusiasm than skill, were less about craft and more about a group of teenagers who had grown up believing that a life on screen was not a fantasy, but simply the next logical step. School, by contrast, held little interest for him. He left Santa Monica High School before graduating, a decision that in hindsight reads less like rebellion and more like a preview of a pattern that would define much of his adult life. An unwillingness, or perhaps an inability, to follow a conventional path when a faster, more thrilling one seemed available. Martin Sheen reportedly worried about that impatience even then, aware from his own experience how quickly an industry built on flattery and quick success could distort a young person's sense of consequence. That impatience did not slow Charlie down professionally, because Hollywood rewarded it almost immediately. In 1986, Oliver Stone cast him in Platoon, a brutal and unflinching depiction of the Vietnam War that would go on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. The production itself was famously grueling. Stone put his young cast through an abbreviated version of military training in the Philippines, stripping away comfort deliberately so the exhaustion and disorientation on screen would feel real rather than performed. Sheen played Chris Taylor, a young soldier stripped of illusions by the horror around him, narrating the film through letters home that trace his slow transformation from idealism to something closer to despair. Critics took notice of an actor who could do far more than trade on his father's name, and the film's success placed Charlie, almost overnight, among a new generation of serious dramatic performers. A year later came Wall Street, again directed by Stone, in which Sheen played Bud Fox, a young stockbroker seduced by wealth, status, and the philosophy of man who believed greed was not just acceptable but admirable. Opposite him, Michael Douglas delivered a performance as Gordon Gekko that would go on to define an entire era's understanding of financial ambition run amok. It is almost impossible now to watch that film without feeling an uncomfortable resonance with the life Sheen was about to live. Bud Fox wanted everything, believed he could handle everything, and discovered too late that the world he had entered did not forgive mistakes the way he assumed it would. Sheen, in real life, was stepping into a nearly identical trap, except no director would yell cut when things went wrong, and there would be no third act in which the consequences resolved themselves neatly within 2 hours. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Charlie Sheen built the kind of career most young actors can only imagine. He proved his range in films like Young Guns, Major League, and Hot Shots, showing a natural comic timing that balanced the intensity he had brought to Platoon. Major League in particular revealed a looser, more playful side of his screen presence, an ability to be charming precisely because he seemed unconcerned with being taken too seriously. He was bankable, magnetic, and increasingly famous not just for his work, but for the life unfolding around it. Reports of heavy partying, substance use, and volatile personal relationships began surfacing with more frequency. But in an industry that has long confused recklessness with charisma, none of it seemed to slow his career down. If anything, it added to his mystique. Hollywood has always had a complicated relationship with its wildest stars, publicly disapproving of scandal while privately profiting from the attention it generates. And for a long stretch, Sheen occupied exactly that space. Famous enough to be forgiven, valuable enough to be protected, useful enough that studios and producers found reasons to look past behavior that would have ended a less profitable career much sooner. But behind the public image, the private cost was accumulating in ways that could not be measured by box office numbers. His family, and particularly his father, watched with the kind of fear that only people who love someone can carry. Martin Sheen had lived through his own difficult years in the industry and understood better than most how quickly admiration could curdle into something far more dangerous. Interventions and stints in treatment became part of Charlie's story well before the broader public understood the extent of what was happening, and recovery, as it so often does, did not arrive as a single dramatic turning point. It arrived, when it arrived at all, in fragments, periods of stability interrupted by relapse, each incident raising the stakes a little higher than the last. For a newspaper, each of those incidents was simply another headline, consumed for a day and forgotten by the next news cycle. For a family, each one meant watching someone they loved disappear a little further into a version of himself they didn't recognize, and wondering, quietly and privately, whether the next phone call would be the one that changed everything permanently. Sheen's personal relationships followed a similarly turbulent arc. His romantic life became tabloid fiction material, marked by engagements, marriages, and separations that played out with intensity that mirrored everything else about his public persona. There was little middle ground in how Charlie Sheen lived, and the people who loved him were often swept into that same lack of moderation, whether they wanted to be or not. It is worth remembering, when discussing a celebrity's chaos, that every headline involving a marriage or a legal dispute involved real people experiencing real pain, often far from the cameras that turned their private struggles into public entertainment. Partners, friends, and family members absorbed consequences that never made it into the tabloid coverage, carrying private worry that had no outlet in a culture more interested in the spectacle than the suffering underneath it. Then, in 2003, came the role that would ultimately define Charlie Sheen more than any of his earlier film work. 2.5 Men premiered on CBS, casting him as Charlie Harper, a wealthy, womanizing jingle writer whose entire existence revolved around avoiding responsibility. The character was charming precisely because he was unapologetic, and audiences responded to that charm in overwhelming numbers. The uncomfortable truth, one that became increasingly difficult to ignore as the years went on, was how closely Charlie Harper resembled the public perception of Charlie Sheen himself. Rather than distancing himself from that resemblance, Sheen seemed to lean into it, allowing the line between performance and persona to blur in a way that made the show feel almost documentary in its authenticity, even as it remained, technically, a multi-camera comedy filmed in front of a live audience. The show became one of the most successful sitcoms in American television history. His salary climbed to a reported $1 million, or more per episode, placing him among the highest-paid actors on television at any point in the medium's history. For nearly a decade, 2.5 Men represented an extraordinary second act, proof that whatever chaos existed outside the studio, the machine inside it could keep running, episode after episode, season after season, largely indifferent to what was happening in the life of the man at its center. The problem with playing a character so close to your own public image is that the line between performance and identity can begin to dissolve. On screen, Charlie Harper's drinking and irresponsibility were punchlines, reset neatly at the end of every episode. Off-screen, there was no reset button. Sheen's marriage to actress Denise Richards ended in a bitter and highly publicized separation, and his later marriage to Brooke Mueller became engulfed in its own instability eventually crossing from gossip columns into courtrooms and formal allegations. Meanwhile, the show kept succeeding, season after season, creating an increasingly stark contrast between Charlie Sheen, professional phenomenon, and Charlie Sheen, a man whose personal life seemed to be unraveling in full view of the public. Producers and executives, according to later reporting, were aware of the widening gap between the two, but the show's ratings made intervention feel, for a long time, unnecessary. That contrast finally collapsed in early 2011 in a sequence of events that remains one of the most extraordinary public breakdowns in modern entertainment history. Production on 2.5 Men was disrupted amid mounting concern over Sheen's behavior and health, and rather than retreating from public view, he did the opposite. He gave a series of interviews marked by an intensity that stunned even veteran entertainment journalists, attacking the show's co-creator Chuck Lorre by name and delivering a string of statements and phrases that spread across television and the still young landscape of social media almost instantly. He spoke about himself in terms that sounded less like self-assessment and more like myth-making, describing himself as untouchable, as someone operating by rules that did not apply to ordinary people. Some of what he said became genuinely, if uncomfortably, entertaining to a public that had never seen a star implode so publicly and so quickly. Much of it was simply alarming to anyone paying close attention, particularly to those who understood that the confidence on display was not strength, but its opposite, a kind of desperate performance staged for an audience that could not tell the difference. In March of 2011, Warner Brothers Television made the decision to fire Charlie Sheen from the show that had made him one of the wealthiest actors in the country. It was an almost unthinkable outcome for a series performing at the peak of its commercial success, and it marked the first time in years that Sheen's fame had failed to insulate him from consequence. Rather than withdrawing, he launched a national speaking tour with a title that seemed to acknowledge, whether intentionally or not, the surreal atmosphere surrounding him. Audiences bought tickets partly to be entertained and partly, uncomfortably, to witness someone in crisis. Reviews of the tour were mixed, and the entire spectacle raised a question that entertainment culture has never fully answered. At what point does watching someone's public collapse stop being entertainment and start being something closer to voyeurism? Social media, still relatively new at the time, accelerated every remark he made into a global conversation within hours, turning what might once have taken weeks to spread into an almost instantaneous cultural event. 2.5 Men, remarkably, continued without him, eventually bringing in Ashton Kutcher to fill the role Sheen had occupied for 8 seasons. The show's survival carried its own symbolic weight. For years, it had seemed impossible to imagine the series without him at its center, and yet television, like the rest of the industry, proved perfectly capable of moving forward. That may be one of the more sobering lessons embedded in Sheen's story. Fame convinces its recipients that they're indispensable, when in reality very few people, no matter how talented or beloved, ever truly are. Sheen returned to television the following year with Anger Management, a series that ran for 100 episodes and proved that a portion of the audience remained curious about him. But something fundamental had shifted. The illusion of invincibility that had defined his earlier career was gone, and no amount of ratings could fully restore it. Insurance companies, producers, and studios now approached him with a caution that had never existed during his earlier years of success, a quiet but permanent recalibration of how the industry was willing to trust him. If 2011 was a moment the public watched Charlie Sheen's professional world collapse, 2015 brought a different kind of reckoning entirely, one with none of the dark comedy that had surrounded the events 4 years earlier. Sheen appeared on NBC's Today program and disclosed publicly that he was HIV positive, revealing that he had been living with the diagnosis privately for several years. He described the burden of trying to manage his health while keeping the truth hidden from a public that already scrutinized nearly every other part of his life. Medical advances in antiretroviral treatment had transformed what an HIV diagnosis meant by the 2010s, turning what was once treated as an almost certain death sentence into a manageable chronic condition for those with access to consistent care. But the social stigma attached to the diagnosis remained powerful, and for a man whose life had already been picked apart by tabloids for decades, the fear of exposure had clearly taken its own psychological toll. Sheen later said that part of what drove him to disclose his status publicly was the pressure of people who had learned of his diagnosis privately and, according to his own account, sought payment in exchange for silence. Whatever precise details of those arrangements, the underlying picture they painted was troubling. A level of fame so consuming that even a private medical condition could become a bargaining chip for people orbiting his life. Choosing to disclose the diagnosis publicly, rather than continuing to manage it through secrecy and payoffs, represented something unusual in Sheen's story up to that point. An attempt to regain control, not through defiance, but through honesty. Public health researchers later noted a measurable increase in HIV-related searches and testing inquiries following his announcement, a phenomenon that has been referred to informally as the Charlie Sheen effect. It stands as one of the rare instances in a story where personal crisis produced something resembling public good, even if that was never the primary intention behind the disclosure. For a man who had spent much of his career chasing attention, this was attention he never wanted, arriving over a part of his life he had fought desperately to keep private. The years following his 2015 announcement were noticeably quieter than the chaos of 2011, and that quiet, more than any single event, may represent the real turning point of his later life. Sheen has spoken about deciding to stop drinking in late 2017, describing a specific moment involving one of his daughters that forced him to see his drinking with a clarity he had avoided for years. He had promised to drive her somewhere and realized, at the moment it mattered, that he could not safely do it. Someone else had to step in. It is a small, almost mundane story compared to the scale of everything that preceded it. No cameras, no headlines, no viral moment. And that may be exactly why it worked in a way that years of public humiliation, job loss, and hospitalization had not. Recovery, for many people who have lived through addiction, rarely arrives through the loudest catastrophe. It often arrives through a quiet, private moment that finally becomes unbearable in a way the person can no longer rationalize away. Sobriety, once established, required a discipline entirely unfamiliar to the version of Charlie Sheen the public had known for decades, a discipline built not on grand gestures, but on the unglamorous repetition of the same decision, made again and again, day after day. What followed sobriety was not a cinematic redemption arc, and that absence of easy triumph is part of what makes the later chapter of Sheen's life feel genuinely human rather than manufactured. Rebuilding trust with his 5 children after years of public instability could not happen on the timeline of a press release. His daughters with Denise Richards grew up during some of the most turbulent years of his public life, and his twin sons with Brooke Mueller were born into a household shaped by instability and constant media scrutiny. Children do not experience their parents' fame the way audiences do. They inherit the consequences without ever having chosen the spotlight, and no degree of sobriety can retroactively erase what they witnessed or the promises that were broken along the way. Sheen has spoken with more humility in recent years about the toll his behavior took on his family, acknowledging regret in a tone that stands in stark contrast to the defiant bravado of 2011. That shift in tone, from someone insisting he was winning to someone acknowledging what he lost, may be the clearest evidence of genuine change available to the public. His relationship with Denise Richards also evolved over time into something less defined by the hostility that had characterized their divorce. Shared responsibility for their daughters gave both of them a reason to find a workable, if imperfect, peace and time, even when it does not produce friendship, often produces perspective. That perspective seems to have extended into Sheen's professional relationships as well, most notably his eventual reconciliation with Chuck Lorre, the man he had publicly and viciously attacked during the height of his 2011 breakdown. For years, any reconciliation between the two seemed almost unimaginable given how personal and public their conflict had become. Yet Sheen eventually appeared in Lorre's HBO series Bookie, playing a fictionalized version of himself, marking a quiet but meaningful moment of professional repair. There was no dramatic public apology attached to it, no interview moment designed for headlines. It was simply 2 men who had once represented one of television's ugliest feuds finding a way to work together again, which in its understated way said more about how far Sheen had traveled than any carefully staged redemption narrative could have. Sheen has also spoken more openly in recent years through interviews and retrospective projects, including his own memoir, in which he has revisited the worst periods of his life with a level of candor that was largely absent during the years he lived through them. That willingness to examine rather than defend his past marks one of the more meaningful shifts in how the public can now understand his story. During the peak of his most chaotic period, the public mostly experienced spectacle. Another interview, another outrageous headline, another viral clip. From the distance of years, the pattern becomes far easier to see for what it actually was. Not a single sudden breakdown, but the slow accumulation of addiction, unchecked entitlement, fractured relationships, and industry culture that had rewarded his most self-destructive behavior for years before finally deciding it could no longer afford to. None of that removes his personal responsibility for the harm he caused. But it does complicate the simple narrative of a celebrity who simply lost his mind, replacing it with something closer to the truth. A talented, deeply flawed man whose worst impulses were repeatedly enabled by an industry that profited from them until it didn't. It is also worth considering how thoroughly the culture around Sheen participated in his unraveling before it ever expressed concern for him. Catchphrases from his most unstable period were repeated as jokes at parties. Interviews were replayed for laughs on late-night television. His breakdown became, briefly, one of the most profitable news stories in the country, generating advertising revenue for outlets that covered every detail of a man's public disintegration with the same enthusiasm they might have applied to a championship game. That dynamic complicates any attempt to view his story purely as one of individual failure. Charlie Sheen made choices, many of them damaging, and he alone bears responsibility for the people he hurt along the way. But he made those choices inside a system that had spent decades teaching him that consequences were negotiable so long as the ratings remained strong. And untangling personal accountability from structural enablement is one of the more difficult and more honest tasks involved in telling his story fairly. There is something particularly poignant about hearing genuine regret from a person who once seemed to have been given everything. Charlie Sheen was never short on talent, and Hollywood never denied him opportunity. His failures were not the result of being overlooked or shut out. They were the result of years spent unable or unwilling to protect what had already been given, which is a far more difficult kind of loss to reckon with than simple bad luck. Few people ever get the chance he was given in the first place, which makes a year spent nearly destroying it feel less like misfortune and more like a genuinely tragic waste in the oldest and most literal sense of that word. At 60, Charlie Sheen occupies a strange and singular place in American celebrity culture. Younger audiences often know him primarily through the memes and viral clips of 2011, a flattened, almost cartoonish version of a much more complicated man. Older audiences remember the fuller arc. The promising dramatic actor of Platoon, the ambitious young star of Wall Street, the comedic anchor of one of television's biggest sitcoms, the addict, the tabloid disaster, the man who disclosed his HIV status to the world, and now the sober father trying to make up for years he cannot get back. All of those versions are real. None of them, on their own, tell the complete story. What connects them is a single thread that runs through the entire arc of his life. A man whose greatest gift, the ability to command attention, became for a long stretch of years the very thing that nearly destroyed him. There is no tidy end and offer here, and Sheen's story resists the kind of clean redemption arc that documentaries often reach for, because real recovery rarely provides one. He did not reclaim the level of fame he once held. He did not undo the years lost with his children, even if he has worked to be present for the years that remain. He did not erase the public record of his worst moments, which remains searchable and endlessly replayable in a way few people in recovery ever have to contend with. What he has done, instead, is something quieter and in some ways harder. He has stayed sober, he has shown up, he has tried to rebuild what could be rebuilt and made peace with what could not. For a man who spent decades living as loudly as fame would allow, choosing an ordinary life, waking up sober, keeping his word, being present for his children, may be the most extraordinary transformation of all. Perhaps that is the real tragedy of Charlie Sheen at 60, and perhaps also its quiet grace. Not that he fell from the heights of Hollywood, because plenty of people fall and are quickly forgotten. The deeper sorrow is that it took him decades and the loss of nearly everything he had built to understand what he actually had in the first place. Clarity, when it finally arrives, is its own kind of gift, even when what it reveals is painful. Charlie Sheen can now look back at the films, the marriage, the children, the addiction, and the years he cannot get back with an honesty that eluded him for most of his life. He cannot rewrite what happened. No one ever can. But he can decide every single day from here forward what he chooses to do with whatever time remains. And for a man who once seemed determined to burn through every chance he was given, that quiet, deliberate choice may be the most important role he has left to play